China is in a precarious position due to the fact that it is confronted with a myriad of challenges, some of which include the COVID-19 pandemic, economic problems, and tensions with Western nations. One of the issues that is rarely taken into consideration is China's heavy reliance on oil. The country has a higher per capita consumption of oil than any other nation on the planet, with the exception of the United States of America. The Chinese military, China's factories, and the lives of ordinary Chinese citizens all require oil to function properly. Should there be a disruption in the supply of oil to China, there may be severe repercussions for the nation as a whole. The United States has taken measures to secure its own oil supplies, such as invading Iraq and supporting the overthrow of governments in other countries. These actions are examples of what are known as security measures. If China possessed the same level of power as the United States, it is likely that they would take the same course of action. The acquisition of resources, most notably oil, has resulted in the involvement of major powers in a number of different nations. The United States has been in a position to take these actions because it possesses the power to do so, whereas China does not possess the same level of influence as the United States does. The United States of America is a preeminent power in the world because it possesses a powerful military, a substantial amount of influence, and a deciding role in a variety of international organizations, including NATO and the United Nations. It is able to take actions that, if taken by other countries, would be met with resistance and would bring about negative consequences. Because it lacks the financial resources and narrative control of the United States, China, on the other hand, must be more strategic in its pursuit of resources, such as oil. China is competing with the United States for these resources. China has resorted not to the use of military force, but rather to the use of financial warfare in order to secure resources. One example of this strategy is the use of debt in countries such as Iraq. However, China is currently dealing with its own unique set of difficulties, one of which is a severe drought that has resulted in an inadequate supply of electrical power. Because of the drought, 66 rivers have run dry, which has resulted in a decrease in the amount of hydropower produced and an increase in the demand for electricity due to the increased use of air conditioning. As a direct consequence of this, China is currently practicing electricity rationing. Due to a confluence of a number of unfavorable and, for the most part, avoidable occurrences, including a severe drought and growing tensions with the United States, China is in the midst of a significant energy crisis. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, the drought, which is one of the worst in the past more than 50 years, has resulted in widespread power outages and has forced factories to shut down, causing additional economic hardship. Additionally, as a result of the drought, the autumn harvest is in jeopardy, and thousands of Chinese citizens are in need of assistance from the government. Even before the drought, China was not energy independent and relied heavily on imported oil. Major sources of this oil came from Saudi Arabia and Russia. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia has strong ties to the United States and has the ability to cut off China's oil supply in the event that the United States engages in hostilities or imposes sanctions. Saudi Arabia provides 17% of China's imported oil, while Russia provides 15% of China's oil needs. China will need to diversify its oil sources in order to ensure that it has access to a dependable and consistent source of energy. Because it relies so heavily on imported oil, which must be transported through waterways that are under the jurisdiction of the United States Navy, China is in a precarious position with regard to the availability of its oil supply. As a direct consequence of this, the supply of oil that China receives is entirely dependent on the United States. China will be required to diversify its energy sources in order to ensure the continuity and dependability of its energy supply. Iraq is a country that has been ravaged by years of violence and war, but it is also home to some of the largest oil reserves in the world. This country could be a solution for China's energy crisis. If Iraq were able to successfully extract and refine its oil, the country would likely become one of the wealthiest in the Middle Eastern region. The country is estimated to hold 12% of the world's total oil reserves. However, the Iraqi government does not have the financial resources to do so, so it has been forced to rely on assistance from other countries, particularly the United States, in order to develop its oil industry. Because Iraq does not have a particularly cordial relationship with the United States and is vulnerable as a result of its recent history of violence and war, China may be able to manipulate Iraq into providing oil in exchange for the necessary funding and support. In the year 2020, Iraq held a referendum to expel American troops from the country, and President Joe Biden of the United States announced that American forces would be withdrawn from Iraq at the same time. This resulted in the country, which had been ravaged by years of war and is in desperate need of billions of dollars for reconstruction, falling into a power and financial vacuum. However, there are only a small number of countries that have the financial means to lend to Iraq, and this number has significantly decreased now that the United States is no longer an option. China recognizes an opportunity presented by the current circumstance and proposes a program known as Oil for Construction. Under the terms of this program, China will provide Iraq with $10.5 billion in exchange for oil in order to construct 8,000 schools, an airport, and a new city. Iraq will receive assistance from Chinese companies in the construction of its oil refining infrastructure as well as other projects. In spite of the fact that this may give the impression that China is acting benevolently toward Iraq, the reality is that China is not merely donating money to Iraq, but is also anticipating a return on its investment in the form of oil from Iraq. As a component of its Oil for Construction program, China is providing Iraq with a loan in the amount of $10 billion. However, this loan is actually a way for China to gain control over Iraq's oil industry and infiltrate the Iraqi economy. China has a long-term goal of becoming the world's largest oil producer. The loan will be used to finance the construction of various infrastructure projects in Iraq, which will be carried out by Chinese companies and later paid for by the Iraqi government. In addition to being responsible for repaying the loan, along with the interest that was accrued on it, Iraq will also be required to sell oil to China and use the proceeds from those sales to pay off the debt. Because of this, China will continue to hold Iraq in debt for at least the next decade, and Iraq's economy will become increasingly dependent on Chinese loans and infrastructure in order to function properly. In the meantime, China will have access to an almost inexhaustible supply of oil, which will put the United States of America out of reach. This is very similar to what the United States has been doing to other countries for the past few decades, which is to use war as a last resort in order to gain control over their resources. The strategy that China utilizes is a form of financial weaponry, comparable to that which is used by corporations. The developed nations of the West, such as the United States and Europe, have attained their current levels of wealth and power, all while keeping those countries mired in debt, while also drawing on external populations for inexpensive labor. The most powerful governments and corporations have been able to prosper thanks to the emergence of a new form of slavery known as financial slavery. Apple is a good illustration of this, as the company is dependent on the low-cost labor available in China to manufacture its products. The exploitation of labor has been the driving force behind the rise to power of a great number of influential institutions. But thanks to advances in technology, private individuals can now also capitalize on this strategy to amass wealth and influence. However, it is essential that this be done without resorting to any methods that are unethical. China handles conflict with its adversaries in a manner that is distinct from other countries. To subvert and undermine its competitors, China employs strategies that are more subtle than those used by the United States, which prefers to resort to violence. The war in Iraq is a good illustration of this point. Although the conflict brought about the demoralization of the American armed forces, it also provided an opportunity for China to strengthen its position as the world's preeminent economic power. Because China took advantage of this opportunity to infiltrate Iraq's economy and secure an almost endless supply of oil, Iraq is now dependent on China for the country's continued economic growth. This is a much more effective method than resorting to warfare, and it enables China to emerge as the dominant player on the global stage without ever having to fire a single shot in combat.